The amphitheater aboard the Xenocultural Warfare Academy hovered silently in orbit over the neutral moon of Veltheris III. Inside, rows of students from over 50 species sat beneath a domed ceiling of shifting stars. The auditorium could seat 500, yet not a single murmur echoed through the tiered levels as the large central holoscreen flickered to life. The topic of the day: Death World Case Study, Human Urban Warfare. Professor Zira Valtun, a veteran tactician of the Mekari Intelligence Corps, stepped onto the platform. Her long tendrils shimmered with a hint of anticipation. She had taught this unit for 12 years and had never once skipped the Earth module. No matter how many times she showed this lesson, it always produced the same result: stunned silence, discomfort, and a new respect for the Death Worlders no one truly understood. Her voice echoed calmly across the room, translated in real time to each student's neural implant. Today's lecture explores the siege of New Damascus, an urban conflict on Terra Prime, Earth's fourth continental superzone, during the final years of the Hydron Reclamation Crisis. This event is not simulated. All footage is raw, original, unaltered. Viewer discretion is advised. As the lights dimmed, the room seemed to pull inward. Cadets leaned forward. Some adjusted their translators. Others simply stared. In row 3, near the right-hand edge of the central aisle, a human girl sat motionless. Her name was Lena Arkwright, barely 20 Earth years old. She wore her academy uniform like every other cadet, her hair tied back in the strict double-knot regulation standard. Her boots were polished, her posture rigid, but her eyes were wrong. Not dead, not dulled, just watching, as if she had already seen what everyone else was about to. The holoscreen expanded to fill the entire front wall. The first image appeared, a fractured skyline buried in dust, distant fire blooming silently on the horizon. The audio kicked in next. Chaotic overlapping signals, a mixture of distress calls, ground-level screams, and bone-rattling impacts. The narrator, a former Earth journalist whose voice had been recovered posthumously, began, "Day 19. We lost contact with Sector B9 this morning. Rations are down to 1 unit per family. We tried to boil the air filters clean, but the carbon smell still sticks to the skin." An explosion rocked the view. Dust consumed the lens. Then, blurred movement, a child dragging another child through the rubble, both no older than 10. The girl screamed something that never translated. The screen glitched, then steadied. Next, a mother curled over a pile of blankets while soldiers used her rooftop to fire makeshift mortars. Some cadets shifted uncomfortably. A Drevlaran student in the front row folded his lower limbs beneath him, antennae twitching in distress. One of the avian killerans let out a quiet whistle of confusion. Even the stoic Ilven, known for their lack of visible emotion, glanced sideways at one another. But Lena did not move. Her face remained still as concrete, her fingers resting together in her lap. Her eyes never left the screen. The footage grew worse. A hallway lined with bodies. A soldier in full armor sobbing into a melted wall. A man screaming over an empty water tank while drones zipped overhead, ignoring him. Then came the images of night. Green-lit thermal footage as civilians crawled through collapsed sewer grates while enemy patrols swept above them. The narration faded. There were no more words, only images. The professor stood to the side of the screen, arms folded. "These were not trained soldiers," she said slowly. "These were civilians, merchants, farmers, sanitation workers, elders, and orphans. This city had no planetary defense grid. Its outer barriers were shattered in under 16 hours. What followed was not strategy. It was will." A murmur moved through the room. One of the Gorellan cadets, a male with a polished exo-chassis, raised his voice. "But this is madness! There were no defensive positions, no hierarchy, no fallback line. It was chaos." Professor Valtun nodded once. "Correct. But chaos, as Earth has taught us, is a fuel source." A new clip rolled. This time, the perspective was from an enemy soldier's helmet cam, taken post-mortem, recovered from the battlefield. The soldier moved through a flooded corridor. The water was red. His breathing grew heavier. Then, a sudden blast of light. From the shadows, a teenage girl lunged with a sharpened pipe, striking the helmet. The footage cut to black. More discomfort in the room. The professor continued. This is the segment I want you to remember. Watch closely. The final sequence began. A drone hovered high above a city block. Collapsing buildings, flickers of movement, then an unmistakable scene. A girl, covered in ash and blood, carrying what appeared to be her younger brother in her arms. Her face was half lit by firelight, one eye swollen shut. She walked barefoot across shattered glass, never looking away from the horizon. There were no subtitles, no music, just silence and her footsteps echoing beneath the drone's microphone. And then, without warning, Lena lifted her hand. The motion was subtle but sharp, a break in her posture so sudden it drew the attention of those around her. The student beside her turned. She spoke calmly, without emotion, in a voice that carried just enough to be heard by those nearby. I was there. The professor turned. The video paused. The entire amphitheater fell still. No one spoke. Lena didn't look at the screen anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the middle distance. She didn't need to watch the rest. She already had. Not as an academic exercise, but in real time, with no pause button. The Drevlaran in the front row looked over his shoulder, eyes wide. What do you mean? She didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and slowly stood, not defiant, not theatrical, just certain. The professor stepped forward. Cadet Arkwright, are you making a factual statement? Lena turned her head and met the instructor's gaze. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't shake. Yes, Professor, I was there. That girl on the screen, that was me. No one laughed. No one doubted her. She didn't give them the space to. She sat back down, folded her hands again, and went quiet. For several long seconds, the room remained frozen. No one dared to restart the footage. The professor turned slowly back to the screen, but didn't move. The image of the ash-covered girl holding her brother remained, paused forever at the moment before the screen would have faded to black. Lena stared straight ahead, her eyes focused on nothing visible. And every alien in the room, no matter how advanced their culture, no matter how layered their diplomacy, suddenly understood one thing in their bones. Humans didn't just survive war. Sometimes they came back from it still walking. No one moved. Even after Lena Arkwright lowered her hand and sat back down, the echo of her words lingered in the air like static, unshakable, uncomfortable, unforgettable. For the first time since the lecture began, Professor Valtuun did not speak. Her gaze rested not on the paused screen but on Lena's profile, as though recalculating everything she thought she knew about humans. Silence gripped the amphitheater, broken only by the soft, mechanical whir of the hovering holoprojector as it kept the frozen image suspended mid-frame. A barefoot girl walking through flames, carrying a broken body like a sacred weight. The cadets stared, but not at the footage. All eyes turned to Lena. The Ilvan male in row 5 leaned forward and whispered, "Is this part of the simulation?" A Gorellan student 2 rows behind him answered aloud, though his voice cracked, "No, I don't think this is staged." A low buzz of confusion spread across the room, students blinking, shifting, exchanging glances as if struggling to digest the truth. The idea that one of their own hadn't just studied war but lived through it disrupted every assumption they held about humans and about this academy's safety bubble. Lena had not just broken the emotional barrier, she had shattered the academic distance between theory and reality. The professor stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, as though approaching a live weapon without triggering it. "Cadet Arkwright, are you willing to clarify what you meant?" Lena didn't blink. "The footage you showed," she said plainly, "was from New Damascus. It was from the 3rd week of the siege. The girl carrying the boy, that was me and my brother." She spoke in the same voice one might use to list coordinates or state a starship serial number. Not cold, just functional, precise. Professor Valtuun hesitated. "You are certain?" "I don't need to be certain," Lena replied. "I remember the shirt I tore to bind his stomach. I remember the weight of his arms sliding every time I lost my grip. And I remember the drone above us. I looked straight into its lens!" A Zalarian cadet in the upper seats shifted, her feathers ruffling uncomfortably. "Why didn't you say anything when the video started?" Lena finally turned her head. Her gaze swept the room like a calm blade. "Because I wanted to see how far the rest of you could watch before turning away." No one had an answer. The professor turned off the projector. The image vanished, leaving the curved wall blank and sterile again. The lights overhead brightened gradually, restoring the artificial daylight of the chamber. "I believe we need to pause the session," the professor said, but her voice had lost its earlier control. It no longer directed the room. Now it echoed around Lena's presence. But Lena stood again. "If I may," she said. The professor blinked. "You wish to speak?" "I think it's better if I say this now," Lena replied. "Because if I wait, you'll all go back to thinking this was just history." The room stilled once more. Lena stepped forward and descended the stairs between the rows. Her boots echoed on the metal steps. She didn't stand at the podium. She stood beside it, one hand resting gently against the edge of the console as if anchoring herself there. "When I was 9, she began, "the first shell hit 5 kilometers from our school. No warning, just an impact. The windows turned to shards. I remember watching my teacher bleed out beside the whiteboard. She was pregnant. Her name was Maurice." Several cadets flinched. No one took notes now. No one even breathed too loudly. "My father was stationed with the Water Distribution Corps," she continued. "He died trying to protect our pumping station from looters who were just as desperate as we were. My mother was vaporized by an orbital strike in the second week. My brother and I were pulled from the rubble by a drone that mistook us for debris. That's how we got out. That's how that video exists." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. "He was alive when I carried him," she added. "He died after the camera turned away." The Ilvan student looked down at his lap. The Garrulin clenched his fists. One of the Silurins had tears visibly glistening on her feathers. Lena looked up, her gaze sweeping across her classmates. Not with bitterness, not with superiority, but with unblinking gravity. "You come here to study humanity because we're the galaxy's most famous death worlders. Because you think we're fascinating, violent, primitive, resilient, and I suppose we are. But what none of you seem to understand is that we don't learn about war. We carry it. In our muscles, in our dreams. In the way we build cities with bomb shelters underground before we even finish the hospitals." The professor made no move to interrupt. "You think we're reckless?" Lena said. "But we've just had more time to become efficient at surviving. You think we're too emotional. But when your entire family dies in front of you and you still get up the next day to protect someone else, that's not weakness. That's something you don't even have a word for in your language." The silence that followed was heavier than any drone footage. Then, finally, someone in the back spoke, a small voice, hesitant. "Why did you come here?" Lena turned her head toward the question, expression unreadable. "Because I didn't want to keep remembering alone." No one dared reply. She took one step back and nodded politely toward the professor. "That's all," she said. Then she walked back to her seat. No one clapped. No one blinked. The professor turned off the session recording system. "For the remainder of today," she said carefully, "this classroom is dismissed." One by one, students rose from their seats. But none looked at each other. Some left quickly. Others paused by the door. A few glanced back at Lena, who sat motionless in row 3, her hands back in her lap, her face expressionless once more. As the doors closed, the last thing the remaining students saw was the quiet human girl staring ahead, no longer as a cadet, but as a reminder, not of war, but of what lives after it. Lena remained seated in the now empty amphitheater long after the last cadet filed out. The silence that followed their exit wasn't peaceful, it was thick, like the heavy stillness of air just before a siren. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers still, her gaze unfixed, not searching for anything but also not blank. She wasn't reliving a memory. She had never left it. The door at the back of the room hissed open. Footsteps approached, slow, hesitant, deliberate. Professor Valtoon did not announce herself. She simply walked down the rows until she stood at the edge of the third. She didn't speak immediately. She watched Lena as if unsure whether her presence would fracture something fragile. But Lena looked up first. "I'm fine," she said flatly, though her voice was slightly hoarser than before. The professor's long fingers folded together in front of her. "That was not the intention of the lesson. You weren't meant to be exposed like that. Lena shook her head. I wasn't exposed. You all were. The professor inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth. She waited, silently giving Lena space to decide what came next. Lena exhaled, quietly. Then she leaned back into the seat and stared at the ceiling. Everyone watches the videos, the explosions, the fire, the crying, but no one ever asks what comes after the footage ends. The professor didn't interrupt. They don't show what silence feels like after the final strike, Lena continued. The way your ears ring for hours because your brain keeps searching for the next sound. They don't show what food tastes like when it's half-melted packaging and chemical preservatives, or how you learn to breathe through your mouth because the stench of burning bone never leaves the air. The words weren't emotional. They were factual, and that made them cut deeper. Every documentary ends with rescue, Lena said, but most of us didn't get that. Most of us just kept moving until movement was all we had. The professor took a slow breath. You don't have to continue, Lena. But I do, Lena said, looking at her. Because no one else will. She stood, suddenly needing to move. Her boots clacked softly against the floor as she paced a short line near the aisle. Her fingers fidgeted unconsciously with the edge of her sleeve. They don't show the decisions. That's what I remember most. Not the chaos. The choices. She paused. Like when you're hiding in a basement and there's a knock on the door. Could be someone begging for shelter. Could be someone looting. Could be someone who thinks killing you will buy them another ration. The professor's voice was gentle. What did you do? I didn't open the door, Lena said, and the sound went away after a while. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. And then, she added, her voice thinner now, there were the sounds of children crying in another room. I knew the building had collapsed. I couldn't dig through it. I didn't have tools. I didn't have the strength. So I sat there. For hours. Listening. She looked down at her hands. I remember that more than any explosion. I remember not saving someone because I couldn't. And I remember what it did to my chest when the crying stopped. The professor finally sat down, 2 rows above, just close enough to listen without crowding. You carried this alone for too long. Lena nodded. Because that's what survivors do. The lights overhead began to dim slightly, responding to the station's circadian cycle. The wall panels shifted hues, casting the room in pale lavender. Lena moved to the edge of the aisle and looked out at the empty instructor's podium. I know what most of the cadets think of me, she said. Quiet, cold, strange, like I don't belong here. The professor's voice was even. You belong more than most. Lena didn't respond right away. Then she whispered, I didn't want to speak. But when I saw my brother's face on that screen, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore, because it wasn't just my memory. It was his too. The professor stood and joined her at the front of the room. I believe the others heard you, Lena, truly. They heard me, she said, but they didn't understand me, not really. The professor nodded. Then help them understand. Lena glanced at her. How? Not with more lectures, the professor replied. With truth, personal, unfiltered, no translation, no sanitizing. Lena raised an eyebrow. You want me to give a testimony? I want you to teach. The idea hung in the air. Lena folded her arms. I'm not a teacher. You're a survivor, the professor said. That makes you the most qualified person in this room. Lena didn't answer, but something behind her eyes shifted. The professor walked to the door, pausing before it opened. Think about it. This academy trains diplomats, officers, and commanders. They can recite war theory, but you can teach them what comes after war ends, and what stays behind. The doors hissed open, and she left. Lena stood alone again, but it no longer felt like isolation. It felt like something had begun. She sat back down slowly, her back straight, and pulled out her data pad. She opened a blank file, stared at the cursor blinking at her. Her fingers hovered. Then she typed the first sentence. War doesn't end when the bombs stop. It ends when the ones who lived through it find a way to speak. And this time she wouldn't stay silent. The next morning began like any other. Uniforms pressed, corridors humming with scheduled foot traffic, cadets flowing from hall to hall in organized streams of motion. The Xenocultural Warfare Academy had always prided itself on structure, predictability, routine. But that morning, as Lena entered Lecture Hall 6A, she immediately felt the tension. It wasn't directed at her, not anymore. It was quieter, more respectful, even uncertain. Cadets glanced at her without the mockery that used to follow her name. No whispers, no curious giggles, just silence and nods. She took her usual seat in the third row. The moment she placed her datapad on the desk, she noticed something strange. There was no hollow screen, no startup hum from the projector, no lecture notes preloaded. Professor Valtoon walked in 2 minutes later alone, without her usual data spheres or assistants. Her robes looked slightly looser, as if she had dressed without caring for perfect symmetry. She stood before the class, her hands clasped loosely, her posture more human than anyone had ever seen from her species. Then she said something that stunned the room. "We will not be covering doctrine today. We will be listening." A few cadets looked at each other. One Ilvan male raised his brow ridges in confusion. The professor continued. "Following yesterday's session, I was contacted by the ethics board and granted permission to bypass the formal curriculum for a supplemental module. This lesson is not drawn from simulations or sanctioned archives. It comes from lived experience, from someone here among you." Lena's jaw tensed. "I offered Cadet Arkwright the opportunity to return to the shadows," the professor added. "She declined." Lena stood. She didn't rise dramatically. She didn't carry a speech in her hand. She stepped forward and walked slowly to the podium, her boots making soft contact with the floor. Every head in the room turned to follow her. Not one expression was mocking. She rested her hand on the edge of the console and looked out. "I've been asked to speak," she began. "But I won't give a lecture. I'm not a strategist. I'm not a historian. I'm just someone who survived what all of you study." A few murmurs, then silence. "I want to talk about the days after the footage stopped, when the drones left, when the lights went out, when there were no uniforms, no sides, no maps, just the broken." She spoke evenly, never raising her voice. And yet every ear strained toward her. "I remember the smell of iron on my palms. I remember how you begin to talk to walls just to feel less alone. How you forget your name because no one says it out loud anymore. How your hands shake so much that holding a spoon feels like lifting metal." She took a breath. "And I remember when a soldier dropped her ration kit near my bunker. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. She didn't see me. I didn't ask. I took it. I ran. She could have shot me." Lena's hands gripped the edge of the podium slightly tighter. "But she didn't." She looked down. "She saw my face. That was enough." No one moved. Even the breathing in the room had changed. Slower, heavier. Then Lena did something unexpected. She reached into her sleeve pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in aged plastic. She held it up. "This is the last protein bar my brother ever touched. I've kept it for 11 years. Not because I want to eat it. Because I want to remember why I didn't." She set it gently on the podium. War is not just death and survival. It's memory. And that memory lives with you long after the bombs stop. It wakes you at night. It questions every kindness. It teaches you to plan for betrayal, even in peace. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. "Some of you think humans are unstable because we act emotionally. You're wrong. We act emotionally because we learned to feel when everything around us turned numb. That's how we stayed human." The room was still as stone. Professor Valtoon approached from the side, carrying a portable data recorder. "With Cadet Arkwright's permission, this session will be added to the permanent War Ethics Archive." Lena nodded once. The professor set the recorder on the console and turned to the class. "This is no longer just a personal account. It is curriculum." After the session, the silence continued, not awkward but reverent. No one left immediately. Some cadets lingered in the room as if waiting for something to return them to normal, but nothing did. One Zalarian girl approached Lena slowly after the crowd had thinned. "I never knew what real courage looked like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I do." Lena nodded but didn't speak. She didn't need to. Later that evening, the Academy's internal announcement system was updated. A new module appeared on every student's schedule. Human psychological recovery and memory preservation. Mandatory. First session to be led by Cadet Arkwright. Lena stared at her screen when the notification appeared. Her hand hovered above the console. She hadn't asked for this, but now it was hers. She closed the message and turned off the light. For the first time in years, the silence of the room didn't feel like a trap. It felt like something she had made peace with. She lay down, hands folded on her stomach. And when she closed her eyes, she dreamed not of fire or screaming, but of a small, flickering candle someone had once lit for her in a tunnel under New Damascus. She hadn't seen that light in a long time, until now. The first day of the new module arrived without fanfare. The digital bulletin listed it like any other class. HPRMP 101, Human Psychological Recovery and Memory Preservation. Instructor, Cadet Lena Arkwright. No dramatic headers, no warnings, just a location, a time, and her name, now in bold, now seen. Lena walked through the eastern corridor before the scheduled start, dressed in the standard uniform with one minor difference. She wore her brother's tag as a bracelet on her left wrist, the dull metal looped with black paracord. She had no intention of hiding anymore. She wasn't there to convince anyone. She was there because memory demanded voice. The classroom was smaller than the amphitheater, but packed. Extra chairs had been brought in. Several students even sat on the floor or leaned against the wall. Faculty members watched silently from the back. Professor Valtoon stood near the exit, not as supervisor but as witness. The only sound in the room came from the steady hum of the environmental controls. Lena entered and walked directly to the front. She carried no datapad, no notes, only a small, faded cloth bundle in one hand. She placed it gently on the console and looked out at the room. She didn't smile, she didn't soften, but something in her presence had changed. She looked not like a survivor telling her story, but like a leader returning from silence. Before she could speak, a voice interrupted her. It came from the center row. A male cadet from the Zarnari delegation, an imposing figure with ivory facial ridges and deep-set amber eyes, stood up, arms crossed. "I have a question," he said, voice firm but not mocking. Lena gestured for him to speak. "Why are we being taught by someone who broke during war?" he asked. "Why should we follow someone whose strength comes from trauma, not reason? We are here to prepare, not to feel." There was a murmur, but no one challenged him. Lena nodded slowly. "That's fair," she said. "Let me answer with a demonstration." She stepped to the console, unwrapped the bundle, and revealed a glass memory core, cracked, weathered, but still functional. She placed it onto the reader plate. The room darkened. A hologram flickered to life. Not drone footage, not battle recordings, just a small, quiet loop. A girl, Lena, younger by nearly a decade, sitting against a wall in darkness. Her face was lit only by the flicker of an emergency lamp. Her arms were wrapped around her knees. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stared. "This was taken by a motion sensor in a collapsed bunker beneath New Damascus," Lena said. "I didn't know it was recording, but it was. For 3 days." The loop repeated once. Then she shut it off. "I didn't break," she said. "I waited. I endured." She turned to the cadet. "You think my strength is weakness because you've never seen what happens after the fight. Your species studies victory in hours. Humans measure survival in years." He said nothing. She continued. "Everyone prepares for battle. No one prepares for what happens after. The smell of rot in your lungs. The guilt of surviving. The way your own reflection feels like a threat. That's what I bring. Not tactics, not drills, memory, the kind that builds you or breaks you when the world forgets your name." The cadet sat down. Slowly. Lena walked back to the center. "You don't have to believe me," she said, "but you'll remember me, and that's enough." She turned off the console. The lights brightened again. Then, without warning, a siren blared through the facility. All heads snapped upward. The walls flashed amber. A synthetic voice echoed through the vents. "Simulation breach. Code level interruption. Students remain in assigned zones. Drill protocol active." The room buzzed. Cadets stood, uncertain. Some reached for concealed weapons despite regulation. Others looked to faculty for instructions. A few panicked, but not Lena. She moved calmly to the door and opened it. "What are you doing?" one Ilvan cadet asked, eyes wide. She looked back. "Listening," she said, "to what others ignore." She stepped out into the corridor, eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling. She didn't flinch at the alarms. She traced the vibration patterns beneath her boots. The siren had a layered hum, false signature. After a minute, she returned. "It's not real," she said. "They're testing behavioral response to chaos. The breach is manufactured. The Academy runs it every 4 cycles. They want to see who leads, who freezes." Professor Valtoon, standing near the entrance, said nothing. Lena walked to the center of the room again. "Humans don't freeze," she said, "because we've learned to live with the sound of sirens as background noise. We don't panic. We scan, we wait, we move, not because we're brave, but because we know what it costs to hesitate." The sirens cut out. The voice returned. "Simulation complete. Drill response recorded. Continue your coursework." Several cadets looked shaken, not by the alarm, but by the fact that she had walked through it like a memory. After the session ended, the students filed out slowly, many in quiet thought. Some stopped by her and nodded. Others couldn't meet her eyes. The Zarnari cadet passed her last. "I spoke from ignorance," he said quietly. "Thank you for not responding with anger." Lena nodded once. "Thank you for listening." When the room was empty, Professor Valtoon walked toward her. "You've changed this place," she said. "No," Lena replied. "This place just remembered what it means to listen." The professor smiled for the first time. It was faint, but it was real. That evening, Lena returned to her quarters. She lit a small candle, the same kind she had dreamed about. It flickered gently on the desk beside her. She opened her datapad and began to write again. Not an assignment, not a report, a message. To the next girl who survives something no one will understand. You're not alone, you're not weak, and you're not a ghost. You're a beginning. She saved it, closed the device, and sat beside the flame, watching it dance. This time she felt no weight on her chest, only warmth. The war had ended long ago, but now, finally, so had the silence.